Good afternoon. My name is John Strope. Welcome to History Nebraska's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. Lectures are held monthly on the third Thursday in the Old Father Family Auditorium at the Nebraska History Museum in downtown Lincoln. Learn more about History Nebraska and our programs and services at history.nebraska.gov. If you are not a member of History Nebraska, I encourage you to join. Your support allows us to provide programs like the Brown Bag Lecture Series free for all Nebraskans. For a full list of membership benefits, visit our website. Special thanks to Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs across the state. We'd also like to thank LNK-TV, a service of the City of Lincoln, which produces these programs. Today's videotaping is sponsored by the Historic Preservation Fund of the U.S. Department of the Interior through History Nebraska to the City of Lincoln, a certified local government. If you would like to watch the previous 180 Brown Bag lectures, visit the History Nebraska YouTube page at youtube.com/History Nebraska. Take a look at playlists and you'll find a bunch. Our topic today is John Johnson, artist of black and white. Our speaker is Ed Zimmer. Dr. Ed Zimmer is the Historic Preservation Planner for the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Department. Just to let you know about asking questions, Ed prefers you wait until the end, unless you are just dying to ask. Please join me in welcoming Ed Zimmer.
I was pretty confident that John could handle a little time before I arrived, and I don't think my confidence was misplaced at all. I want to talk about John Johnson, and I want to focus on John Johnson, the photographer. I think I often speak about the great fun and excitement of researching John Johnson, but I think on this occasion I ought to try to focus on the man and the photography. And I'll edge into the fun I have researching him because I can't resist that. But we see him often in his own photographs. But I want to talk about him as a photographer, as an artist, and also producer, I think, of some really critical historical documents that teach us things we can't really learn any other way about our city and our state. Also an artist in black and white. When Doug Keister and I engaged with Arcadia to publish the book of several hundred of Doug's images, they wanted to label it Lincoln, period. They said it works alphabetically in our index system. It goes on the shelf in the right place. And I said, it's not everything about Lincoln. It's much more focused. Can't we call it Through the Lens of John Johnson? No, that would put it with the T's, not the L's. We finally negotiated we could call it Lincoln in black and white, which is the photographs and the people both. So who was John Johnson? Well, he was the son of Harrison Johnson and Margaret Johnson. Harrison is buried at Wyuka along the O Street fence. You notice Harrison served in the 1st Nebraska Regiment, 1st Nebraska Infantry, which should not quite be possible. Harrison was an African-American man. This was an all-white regiment. In the Civil War, it wasn't until the Emancipation Proclamation that the Union Army was enlisting African-American soldiers. It was part of the Emancipation Proclamation. And they were in all-black units with white officers. But wartime is much about breaking the rules. And Harrison Johnson was a very young man, early teenager, enslaved in Arkansas, who escaped into the arms of the 1st Nebraska. And they not only sheltered him, but allowed him to enlist with them, and he served out the duration of the war with the 1st Nebraska, and then came back to Lincoln after the war, not opting to go to Arkansas, but made Nebraska his home. And Lived in Lincoln till his death in 1900. Typically worked as a cook in Lincoln hotels. Built a little house at 1310 A Street. And I'm not to the part of John Johnson, the photographer, but this is one of his. Built a house about 1881, and this is where John lived most of his life. He was born in 1879, so he would have been only 2 years old when he started living in this house, except for a brief period in the 20s when he lived a little further north in Lincoln. He lived in this house till his death in 1953. John often photographed his mother around the house. Johnson never had a studio, from any information we've found, but most often photographed indoors or outside, and very often on front porches, which is a great benefit if we're trying to figure out who and where, because we can start with 1310. And we happen to know from many photographs that this is the Johnson home, and this is Margaret Johnson, widowed mother of John, probably in the 19-teens in this image, or sitting in a chair on the front steps or just outside the front steps of that same home. And there may be a dozen or more pictures of this house in various vignettes in the Johnson body of work. But I should always caution the Johnson body of work we found so far, because in addition to the 280 images that Doug has, there maybe are about an equal number that we found, or at least to put the total up to about 500 currently. But as recently as a couple of years ago, we found 33 more in Lincoln Public Schools archive. No idea how they got there. Clearly we're the same body of work, so we keep finding, and hopefully we'll find them. Trying to keep my health, I'd like to find more for 20 or 30 more years, if I'm lucky. Johnson attended Lincoln High School, the only high school in the city at the time. Lincoln schools were not segregated in the student body. They were segregated in the employees, particularly the teaching corps. I've seen records in the LPS board minutes back as early as 1880s, putting on file petitions from the colored population about adding colored teachers to the teaching corps, and said, we received another letter, we placed it on file. It wasn't until after World War II that African American teachers were hired. But Johnson and a William Johnson at the far end of this view are shown here, members of the Lincoln High Track Club of 1899. Johnson's the figure on the far right here. And we often see him in the photographs with this sort of stony stare. He's kind of got a set to his face, not in every one of the images, but get the impression maybe he didn't smile easily, although his subjects seemed to smile very easily. So there had to have been a warmth and comfort to his personality, especially the children and the puppies that seemed very comfortable in his views. I just want to note that in the center of that view, there's a young man named Duputrin on the track team at the same time, which is notable just because the Duputrins owned the photo shop in Lincoln that operates from the time of the track team well up into the 20s and 30s. It wasn't Ray, his teammate, but Ray's brother who operated the local camera company, or Kodaks and cameras, two different things in this little listing. But the Duputrins were pretty much where you bought your materials in Lincoln in this time period, and he's got at least a high school acquaintance on the track team with the Duputrins. But the occupations we see Johnson employed in the city directories and other accounts were drayman, laborer, janitor, kind of occupations typically available to African American men, although he's a high school graduate and had at least a year or two of university education at University of Nebraska, where John Johnson played on the football team about 1900. Drayman, if you look it up, typically now lists hauling beer from the brewery to the bars. That wasn't it was a broader meaning. A dray is basically a flat cart, and a drayman was somebody who hauled stuff around for people. This is not a Johnson photo, but it's a non-copyrighted internet picture of that's a dray. And so the fellow driving this is a drayman, and that's one of the occupations that Johnson had. But janitor was the most common one we see listed, and for a long period of time, he was the janitor at the U.S. Post Office and Courthouse. In this view of what looks like maybe the whole janitorial squad, seated on 9th Street, and we're looking east towards what we would call Old City Hall, but originally was the Post Office and Courthouse. Johnson's there in the critical years of the teens when the new post office is built, which we could call Old Federal Building or Grand Manse if we were developers. And Johnson does lots of photographs of the construction and the employees and the life around the post office courthouse. And in this view, you get all of these guys in their rough winter clothes, and at the back of the view is Johnson himself. We see that fairly commonly in the pictures that, and Doug and I argue about what that means, but obviously somebody's clicking the shutter. Doug probably doesn't credit his photos to his helpers. And I don't credit Johnson's photos to his helpers either. Johnson's the principal photographer, whatever else is going on. This is a photo that will only be taken by a janitor photographer. But this is the new toilet room for the postal carriers in the basement of the new post office. And we won't go quite into the lookout blueprint that shows us why the postal workers didn't get individual stalls, but this is the workplace of John Johnson as a paid employee. But he also would take these fanciful, wonderful scenes of the women janitors on the roof of the new post office courthouse. The only building in Lincoln that has that stone balustrade is the new post office courthouse, Old Fed, on P Street. And on the right-hand side, through the stone work, we can see some of the university buildings looking north. It's Richards Hall and Braith. So we know just about where on the roof they were, and that was on the new 1915 portion of the federal building. I think many of Johnson's photos, not just of the African American community, are images that show his perspective as a working man, as a man totally at comfort in his community. He knows people, he has permission to photograph a very broad range of people. And here we get this fellow in a white shirt and tie mowing the grass on the north half of the federal building block before this gets dug out and the 1915 wing built. So this is a photo taken somewhere between 1910 and 1915. And the fountain in the background was the artesian well on the post office, what we call Government Square block. The woman looks like she's in motion. I think she's throwing back a cup of the water. Apparently the water was so foul tasting it must have been good for you. And there were quite a number of people that would go with a cup and take a drink of that water every day. But it had a very high mineral content, like most of the water under Lincoln. But that little fountain that sits in the park space on the southeast quadrant of the block today is modeled more or less on this old fountain that sat in the center of the north half of the block originally. And then this image of Samuel Malick sitting at the back of the post office in his great big brand new car, I think also tells us something about who would pose for Johnson and what kind of, I want to show you some of the range of photos he would take. Many of the people are difficult to identify. Samuel Malick is kind of a snap. He was the police chief, the sheriff, the warden at the penitentiary, and after he'd retired as warden, he had contracts to deliver mail. I don't think door to door. I think he was doing the bulk between cities. He was a big wheel, very, very identifiable, big front page obituary when he dies. And the little account says that he was appointed the warden after there'd been a murderous riot at the prison, and then served 10 months, and then served 10 months as warden, not as prisoner, and then retired, gave his time to his private business and to the care of his contracts for the carrying of the mails. So this is that period when Malick is involved in the post office And Johnson photographs him in his big, beautiful new car at the back door of the post office. Finishing a little bit of personal biography before we go into more of the photos, although I used the photos all through. Johnson took most of his pictures in Lincoln that we can identify, probably a few in Omaha, at least we've seen listings of sites in Omaha he took photos, and carried his camera down to Kansas City. But I think he was a man on a mission in Kansas City. This is identifiable as Swope Park Zoo, and those lion cages are still there. One of the Grand Boulevard plantings in Kansas City. And a typical Kansas City house with that rough limestone work. He was courting a lady. John Johnson was a bachelor until he was 39. In 1918, married Odessa Price, a widow from Kansas City. And I think a number of what we see, and there are pictures that look like they're probably Kansas City scenes with Odessa in the picture. So he's down on a courtship mission with his camera. Resulting in his marriage in 1918 to Odessa Price, and there's the familiar front porch of 1310A, and this handsome picture, and he's in not just a white shirt but a white tie, and she's in this beautiful white dress. Often we find series of pictures that 2 or 3 images will be the same people, related scenes, but kind of stepping through a couple images. And here she's with the cat in the rocking chair up on the porch. To the right-hand side, we see the edge of a porch swing, and then she's on the porch swing and she's reading. These glass plate negatives are very high resolution, very fine grain, and Doug can zoom in to a close detail on many of these. We can get in on that magazine and see a big sailing ship on the front of it. I love libraries. I love Bennett Martin Library because when they had the periodical room downstairs, they brought me a bound set of ladies' home journals I could flip through, and there in August 1918 is that sailing ship on the cover of her. There's the August 1918. This is the month they got married. I think he's taking their wedding pictures in this series of the two together, and her beautiful white dress, hose, and heels, all white. Now to step back a little bit from 1918, because I want to try to introduce a little chronology. What we find of his photos, the earliest we can firmly date are 1910. He's 31 years old in 1910. He's been working in this assortment of jobs, drayman and janitor. And then we start seeing photos. The last photo that we can firmly date is 1926. So it's a rather brief period. We don't know if there were images before 1910 that he threw them all away. It's kind of unlikely because we don't see scenes of Lincoln of earlier events. And we don't know why he stopped taking photos, if in fact he did. But what we can bracket in terms of firm datable images are 1910 to 1926. This image, when we did the book, I couldn't quite figure out exactly what it was. I knew that Station B was a post office in the near-south neighborhood of Lincoln near 17th and Garfield. And it says Station B. Maybe not a great picture, this one. There's something happening here, and a building has collapsed in the middle of the street. Same event. And I think this one, earliest dated photo we can identify, this is May 1910. He's shifted around to a much more interesting image. He's gotten around where you can see the walls have collapsed outward, you can see the rafters kind of with the walls peeled away, people inside trying to salvage. There's much more, I think, composition in this scene. What a blessing newspapers.com is when you're doing this kind of work, because if you figure out the right search terms, and this one was substation collapse, and up comes. They were building a new post office. They had picked up the old one and moved it around the corner to place temporarily, and they hadn't taken the heavy metal safe out of it, and it toppled, and the whole thing came down with 2 postal workers inside, according to this long account. One of them got a bruised hand, but it assures us they both continued work that day. They took the cases out of the collapsed building and just sorted the mail out on the street. So they couldn't sell stamps or money orders, but everything else continued. And we know this is May 1910 and the first identified Johnson photo. November the same year, we had this scene, and this also had baffled us. We knew from the front edge of the locomotive there's a number on it, so we knew it was locomotive, I think it's 1020, or 2040. But with scanned newspapers now, we were able to pull up. Putting train wreck in a search is not a good thing to do. That's like putting auto wreck in a search. Lincoln newspapers reported train wrecks all over the country. But this one with the locomotive number gave us this event. This was two trains, a major locomotive and a switch train that got onto the switch train hadn't cleared its siding when the big heavy ballast train came through, and they collided, threw both locomotives up in the air. All of the trainmen but one jumped off and were bruised. Even the fellow on board managed to escape. There were no fatalities in the accident. But in one of the newspaper descriptions of it, it reports that the wreck soon attracted a great crowd of people in the neighborhood, and they were later reinforced by others from a distance. Many automobiles whirled down, filled with occupants, and several persons with cameras and Kodaks placed their machines in action and took pictures of the prostrate engines and the smashed cars. Don't you wish you were a journalist and could use prostrate engines, in your work? But here we have a description of the young photo buffs in town rushing down to this fun scene, and one of them had to have been John Johnson, because we have the picture. And I think quite a fine picture it is, and I think already by 1910, here again we see that he's finding a vantage point and a composition. You don't have to place the little pump car, the hand cars in the front of this view. You could take just a picture of the upside down locomotive, but he's organized it to really give us a sense of scale, a little drama in what's a still scene. We see the big crane lifting up the tender car. So I think he's reflecting already at this earliest point that we find him taking photos, an eye and a sense of composition, as well as the technical skills to produce a nice, clear image. And then in 1912, what had been the earliest dated view until we got the newspapers lined up on the other two scenes, the unveiling of the Lincoln statue at the state capitol in 1912. This figured into some of the collecting activity in that this image came to us through Tom Casper. Tom was an architect who worked on the restoration of the Capitol for most of his career until he died last year. About 1972, he had come upon a garage sale, yard sale with a bunch of glass negatives, and he recognized his beloved Capitol site. He already was a Capitol fan in the 70s in some of these images. And he collected about 24 glass plate negatives that when we started to get information and publicity on this, much of it through the work of Clarence Mabin, who was reporting on some of the images that we were finding in late 90s, early 2000s. Tom came forward and said, I've got some too, and those are part of the body of knowledge. Upstairs, in addition to the exhibit of Doug's materials on the walls, there's a running slideshow of some of these other Johnson images from the historical site, from History of Nebraska itself, or some of the other collections and sources. It'll be the broadest display of Johnson images yet, because it pulls on multiple collections. This image is one of 4 of that unveiling. This was a much photographed scene, and Matt Hansen, now the staff at the Capitol, has made some really interesting discoveries about what's happening that moment in photography at the scene. And we think one of the images is stepping back behind where Johnson must be standing on something taking the picture. And Matt's going to write a really fine, interesting article about what we know about Johnson and his work from this set of photos and the photo from behind him. Be really fun stuff. Johnson took pictures of, obviously, the events of the day, not just the catastrophes of train crashes and building crashes, but also things like the German Day Parade. There's quite a number of images in one of the sets held by one of the families still in Lincoln of these enormously decorative cars with big floral. This isn't the Rose Bowl. This is Lincoln 1910, 1911, 1912. It's only a couple of years that the German Day parades occurred in Lincoln. Then the events leading up to World War I, even a couple years before World War I, had put an end to that big celebration. But Johnson's obviously taking pictures of those cars in the early teens. And here we see the second state capitol in the background, so it seems to be the staging area for that festival. But most often, and I think most beloved among the Johnson work, is when he's photographing people, families, children within the Lincoln African American community. Many of these have come through each of these collections, and the way we know it's Johnson is there's such a tight overlap of these different sources that we'll see the same people, the same backdrop that he is hauling around from porch to porch, but often the same, from different collections, we'll see photos from the same day. If there's a series, we might see 2 or 3 scattered among different sources. This one comes to us directly through the McWilliams family of Lincoln. John Jefferson McWilliams and Sarah McWilliams had moved here in the 1880s with their 8 kids. They're moving from Falls City area. There were African American families in many small Nebraska communities, but not very many. And interracial marriage was illegal in Nebraska at that time. If you've got 8 kids and want to form families, you're going to move to Omaha or Lincoln or somewhere that they have a social opportunity. And they prospered in Lincoln and gave us generations of Lincolnites and folks scattered around the country. This is John, the founding father of the McWilliams family in Lincoln, John Jefferson McWilliams. He was a Civil War veteran as well. He had been enslaved in Missouri and escaped to sign up for a Kansas regiment. John III is on his lap, his grandson, and his youngest son standing behind him is Paul Revere McWilliams. There's also a Ralph Waldo McWilliams. These are very Americans. I'm also hoping by the time I get to his age I can look that good. He's in his early 70s and I'm getting close. But we see the characteristic backdrop, we see a porch floor. Johnson's typically controlling his lighting by using the shadow of a porch, not bright sunlight. Another McWilliams image coming directly through the family, and this is the same baby with his parents, John Jefferson McWilliams Jr. And his wife Bertha. We see their address above their head. They lived at 851 North 13th Street. Close your eyes and picture the Coliseum. The university expanded into a neighborhood north of Vine Street, south of the tracks. We find at the time of these photos, Lincoln neighborhoods typically were integrated racially, but not in class. Poor people lived where other poor people lived. And that neighborhood around what's now the Coliseum was a mixed neighborhood, lots of African American families, but lots of other poor families. South Bottoms was another particular neighborhood of the German Russian immigrants and quite a few African American families, and many of the African American churches. And still today, Quinn Chapel's at 9th and C in that traditional neighborhood. This McWilliams family has been key to the discovery and the information on the collections as well. The images that started research in my office and put Doug and me in contact. We'd been in contact before, but not about anything as fun as this. Came through the McWilliams family. And key to that, this is not a Johnson photo. This is a studio photo, but this is a brother of John Jr. This is Trago T. McWilliams. The young man on the far left is Trago O. McWilliams. Trago Park is named for Trago T. and Trago O. So it's the next 2 generations of McWilliams. And the little guy in the great suit, leaning against his father's chair, is Art McWilliams Sr. Art McWilliams Jr. is still with us, still a big contributor to the research and the knowledge, and is his father, through whom many of the images came. His father was an amateur historian, a photographer, a writer. He was a community historian. Mabin's article about him in the late 80s, shortly before Art Sr.'s death, called him part historian, part curator. It was historian, writer, historian, photographer, curator, I think, which was a great description of this community history figure and this man. And his son has inherited kind of that role too in the work. But most often we see family groupings. When we can identify them, it's either a gift of the family that someone has recognized individuals, or kind of a combination of something in the scene and then background research. This is a man named Manitoba, or Toby James, with 3 of his children. He worked typically in the cleaning business, dry cleaners, cleaning shops around Lincoln, and then moved to California and had his own cleaning, I think it was Owl Cleaners, he called it. And these are his son on the far right in kind of that little boy's tunic. You often saw the German Russia kids in a tunic like that with a belt. And then his 2 of his daughters beside. The younger girl here was born in 1912, and so we think this is a photo of about 1913, at which time the James family lived at 908 Peach Street. It happens that house is still there, little tiny house. I think it's important, not just it's fun to find these, but I think it's also important to get a sense of what's the bigger scene in which these families lived. Many of these images are people who are beautifully dressed. If you just were reading the photo, you might say, that's middle class. Look at those clothes, look at that scene, look at that porch. Nothing else we see in the documentary record says there's a black middle class in Lincoln in the early 20th century. The employment is closed to even for educated people to any non-menial occupation. And I think we need to know both to really interpret the images. So we see the people in their home setting, but also know something of their circumstance. This tiny little house, if we, there isn't a lot of detail in the photo, but the windows are the right size and shape, the porch is at the right level. It really works well that this is about a 1912, 1913 image. If I turn it black and white, it fits even a little better. And we do this also because it's just fun, and I like to make you go, wow. Real key figure in our research and in identifying Johnson as the photographer came through my colleague Abby Anderson, who was working as an intern and then as a planner in the planning department, and particularly when we got directed by a young lady of 80 to an elder of 95. The elder was Ruth Fawley, Ruth Talbert Green Fawley, and Abby and I met with her, with Charlotte Jackson, who brought us to gain wisdom, and we did. We were trying to describe to Mrs. Fawley, who was virtually blind at the time, photographs that we hoped she could identify. Now, why we thought that was a great idea, but Charlotte had led us there. We're describing a photo of a family grouping, and she quietly got up and went to her bedroom and came back with a box of her family photos and said, that's my family. I'm 8 years old. That's my father, Albert Talbert, Reverend Albert Talbert. He was the pastor of Newman Methodist Church at the time. My brother Dakota, my mother Millie, and John Johnson took our pictures. My father would have Mr. Johnson come when we had a bazaar or a picnic. Mr. Johnson was the photographer in our community. This is 1999, 2001. She's 95 years old. She'd been smart for the whole 20th century and lived the whole 20th century in Lincoln and had a clear memory of events and people. She gave her family Bible and her family photos, some of the images upstairs, including an actual print, and we've found far more negatives than we've found prints. Prints typically come to us through the families, but there's a print upstairs, a Johnson photo of her, printed on postcard stock of Mrs. Fawley as young Ruth Talbert. This is one of those images and also gives us a sense of an historian has to be thinking, can somebody know what they tell me? You do that with any source you use. You have to do it with oral testimony as well. You don't challenge 95-year-old ladies who are helping you of how do you know? But we said something about nice cat. And obviously it's there kind of for that beautiful contrast of the white dress and the black cat. And Mrs. Fawley says, that's not my cat. That was Anna Hill's cat. Anna lived behind us on the alley. I'm not sure what the cat's name was. I think it was Blackie. She knew what she was telling us. She was very clear-minded, very bright individual, and was speaking from depth of knowledge and a generous depth of knowledge. Abby Anderson interviewed her for about a dozen hours in oral history fashion. Those materials were given to Nebraska Historical Society, now History Nebraska as well. And up in the exhibit there is that voice is the conversation between Abby Anderson and Ruth Fawley. Quite a lovely piece of the exhibit. She described those scenes where Johnson came to take pictures. This is her father seated with the glasses. She's standing a row back with her mother, and it's some kind of church bazaar in this scene. So exactly what she described were some of what we were then finding in images. Or her brother with Anna Hill on the left, that's the lady who had the cat. I don't know the lady on the right, but that's Dakota Talbert playing waiter. Occasionally, Johnson gives us beautiful architectural images. This is the old Grace Methodist Church at 27th and R, burned down, I think, 72. One of the finest pictures of that beautiful building, built in the early 19-teens. Most often, those images aren't just buildings, but people in the scenes with their buildings. This is the old Quinn Chapel, same building as Quinn today, but on its original site. It was a building that stood on the north side of F Street between 10th and 11th, and was picked up built 1900, picked up and moved in 1915 over to its present site of 9th and C, and then expanded in 1926. The latest photo that we can document by Johnson was the 1926 expansion and remodeling of this church. This image is also an important one that came to us through the Thomas family in Omaha, who had been a Lincoln family. Stamped on the lower left corner of this postcard is an ink stamp that says John Johnson, 1310A. This is the only signed image we have stamped, but it's stamped with his signature. We have his signature from some other documents and can see it matching up. And then among my favorite images, and I put these in both because I think they're spectacular photos and because we don't know who these children are yet. And there's many of these images, in fact, a larger number. I tend to show you ones where I can tell you the stories. Many of them, we don't know the stories. These kids show up half a dozen times at least in various scenes, various poses. Beautifully posed here in their white clothes on the porch, maybe with mom holding a fistful of the little baby's dress, because we see something kind of spilling down in the lower right, and I think that's probably mom's dress as she's there behind holding on. And that's a little boy, I think. No ribbons in his hair, and kind of a wild spray of hair. I love the older sister and the seriousness of the task of being an older sister to these two younger siblings. Same kids again, in a winter scene. I'm not sure he's in I don't know if there is a boy's winter coat for a baby that size, but it's the same kids, maybe a little younger. or very much the same again. Beautifully organized, how he's positioning the children, how he's positioning the whole scene, and then the technical prowess of catching the beautiful complexions of these very dark complected kids in their very bright white dresses. Somewhere in America there is a piano on which sits this image, and I'm hoping that someone will call and say, that's my mother and her brother and her sister. Mrs. Fawley could tell us who this was from direct memory, a high school classmate of hers, Florence Jones. The setting tells us just enough clues that she's at 7th and N, and we're looking north to the underside of the old overpass. We're on our third overpass there, viaduct across the tracks. This is the original one of the 1890s, which was a steel kind of spindly structure, and we're looking north. There's one of the lumber yards sheds is off on the left-hand side. Florence Jones lived with her mother, Catherine Constellawahi, and the directories say they lived on 7th Street just below N, where Midwest Steel is today. And then to remind, it isn't just the kids, we don't know the pictures. What on earth is this picture telling us? Don't know yet. It's firmly within the body of the Johnson work. Lots of Lincoln people went to Colorado in the summers. And it looks like somebody one summer went to Colorado or somewhere mountainous, and Johnson came along to take family pictures or pictures of the vacationers. There are individual portraits of folks on their horses in this group as well. So many families went, it's almost like putting train wreck in newspaper.com if you put in Lincoln, Colorado summer. Every academic apparently went, and lots of other people. If you didn't go to the Minnesota, you went to Colorado, apparently. But horses do appear with some frequency, and one of my favorite scenes is this little one with sort of a rough stable yard, 2 little kids and 2 tired-looking horses. We can just place the scene if we look at the upper left corner. We see a fragment of signs in the background, and they say expanded Dirk's Lumberyard. Dirk's was at 8th and N on the northwest corner where the LES substation is today. So there on the northeast corner, which is now a gravel parking lot. I knew from other research that 800 N Street, the house that sat on the corner there, was a brothel in the late 19th century at least. And in fact, that whole area south of O and west of 9th was called the Burnt District, and not all but many of Lincoln's brothels were in that area. My kids call it retroactive social work. I wanted to make sure I could convince myself that these kids did not have to grow up in a brothel. I knew from the directories that often the maid at a brothel might be African American, and sometimes her children lived there too. So it was not an impossibility. Johnson's work in 1910 to 26 is the period when mostly the public acceptance of brothels in Lincoln had been extinguished. So I'm kind of working on finding them a better home than what I knew of this address. Also, as I focused in on them, they don't look as polished as the kids in some of the other scenes. Till I came upon this image. 2 little sisters, stair-step sisters, matching dresses, necklaces on, hair combed down tight, shoes laced all the way up, Johnson's backdrop. And then best of all, the older sister, if we compare the two, is cross-eyed. It's the same scene, so now I've got the girls well taken care of. Looked at the surrounding area for census and a family named Hill. There were a couple African-American Hill families in Lincoln, but there was a family named Hill that lived a block away on the other side of N Street, just up the hill. They had stair-step sisters, born right around 1900, 1910, 1911, and these are probably the Hill sisters. in their neighborhood, posed by Johnson with the horses just down on the corner. Also coming through a family, this wonderful image of the Thomas family on their front porch. Because it came through the family, we knew who they were. We knew an address of 715 C Street. I can't show you this embedded in that house today because where the photographer's standing, another house now sits right up against that front porch. There's no, you can't get east of this house more than about a foot. You could pass a sugar bowl from one house to the other there without even stretching. But these are 4 of the Thomas kids. The young guy standing on the right is a cousin, and then a little neighbor girl is leaning against the edge of the porch. The Thomas family figures prominently in Lincoln and in Omaha. The father, Alonzo Thomas, or Lon Thomas, was a cook on Burlington Railroad, involved in a terrible train wreck, badly injured and burned when 2 trains collided in 1911. And I think you can see scars on his face and I think on his hands. And he's got maybe one of the larger catfish maybe ever caught in Salt Creek that he's displaying to his little son. This would be Lon Jr. And his sister Agnes is sitting, and then I don't think we know the name of the other little girl sitting in this view. After the railroad crash, the parents, the Thomas family, ran a little grocery store in the front room of that house. So behind that bay window, a few groceries available, and that was some of how he supported himself after the train wreck. Love this catfish and the little guy with the pole. This image didn't come to us from families, but directly through just the negative. Glass plates can't have a note written on the back. So you start from just, if you don't have somebody with memory, and we're now beyond the period where direct memory, you can have inherited memory that you know a picture is of your forebears, but Miss Fawley would have been one of the last people that photographed in these pictures. We're getting down to very few who could tell us anything in that way. But this image, over the head of the gentleman, this nice front porch, cat, plant, Sunday newspaper on his lap. In close, you can see just barely, in a good scan by Doug, 1821. In the Lincoln City directories of the early 20th century, African Americans were identified with a C in parentheses after their name. I can't think of any good reason why the directory needed to list race, but for research, being able to assemble lists of where families lived, especially when you're only going from an address and you don't even know the street, can be a great benefit. And so I've had cooperative interns who've assembled directories by name or by address, by number. And we had 2 1821s. This wasn't the house I imagined looking at the picture, but it is 1821 South 16th Street. And when you take the picture and put it on the porch, you realize Johnson's giving you the family scene. He's not taking a picture of the whole house. I don't think he's hiding the house, but he's telling you the important part of the family life on this front porch at this moment. From identifying the scene and the directories, we know this is Julius Santilli Miller. He worked a couple different occupations, but mostly as a waiter. She worked sometimes as a domestic and sometimes as a seamstress. That isn't the whole message they want you to have from their portrait. They want to show you their family life at home on their porch. And we'll talk a little bit more about what I think that means. One of my favorite images and one of the most frustrating, no address showing, couldn't figure out what the signs were saying in the background. It just wasn't clicking. But this beautiful tableau, and she's making this wonderful gesture, saying something with her hands. Till we found this postcard of a little dry cleaner on South 9th Street, 222 South 9th Street. is a parking lot now. It's been a couple different buildings after this building was here. But see that sign on the left-hand side? You can put those two images right together. And there was a black family lived just north at, I believe it was 216 South 9th Street. Fletcher Marks and his wife, and Fletcher was another waiter in a downtown hotel. One of the better jobs for an African-American man in Lincoln at the time was a waiter at a downtown hotel, which was the occupation of John Gail Braith, standing with his wife, thankfully, right in front of their address, 727. Hats off, hats on. Very commonly in Johnson pictures we get that. And that building still stands. So once we had the image, this one came rather quickly from those lists of addresses the students had assembled. This tiny little house, 1870s house. It's been refaced in stucco, scored to look like brick, but it still has that pattern over the windows. And they click in pretty nicely to that front porch. The Gail Braiths, there were both the hat on and hat off pictures, and then one, the Gail Braiths standing a little further north up the street next to a house. It shows in the wider view two houses, one of them extant, one of them not, and also that she was a tall woman, taller than her husband. Mabel and John Gail Braith. Her daughter is one of the most frequent subjects in the pictures, Frances Hill, outdoor scenes and also some very lovely indoor portraits of Frances Hill. She worked as a usher in downtown movie theaters and vaudeville houses. Many of the young women of the community were ushers in the teens and 20s. Here, I think probably with her grandmother, if genetics matter, this sure looks like her grandmother, Grandma Hill. And then Frances, who was another classmate of Ruth Fawley, and she could recognize her. And these classmates also give us the wondrous resource of Lincoln High yearbooks with faces and names and known dates. And several of these identifications can be verified through those yearbooks. This lovely scene, big, looks like flocked wallpaper, and then the hanging, maybe on separating a doorway. The Galbraiths lived at several different locations, usually renting, but Frances looks serene and wonderful in this interior view. And Doug points out, some images, a few of the images I think look like he's using a flash. This looks like he's capturing available light very skillfully. And here she looks ready to go, and she did go. She married in the late 1920s, moved to New York City. Ruth Fawley remembered that she died not long after that. I didn't put it in our Lincoln in black and white because I couldn't quite figure out how to document that. But then I found she was interred by the Galbraith family at Wyuka, and it said cause of death was undetermined. So while Miss Fawley remembered that she was mysteriously murdered, I could report that in my Wyuka tour book as an appropriate part of that story. This was a yearbook identification through fellow in California, Stan Schmunk. Stan's a German from Russia, heritage, grew up in the South Bottoms neighborhood, and had both strong memories of some individuals, but also an intense research interest. And he identified Manila Jewett from her yearbook photo. Very modern-looking young woman, I think, in her portrait, partly by her choice of dress and also her very direct, very confident gaze. We can find her also working as an usher in an opera house in Lincoln. And in closing out, a second picnic shot. There's a wonderful image in the Keister collection and in the exhibit of Johnson handling a large group of people in an outdoor setting. Here, not just pulling back from the table, but taking a couple people off the bench and having them stand behind, but very carefully controlling where the people are so we can get everybody in full face. Does the same on this porch scene. And there he is sitting on the front of the porch, probably his mother on the left, and then a couple behind him. We can find through circuitous means this house, which was the house of Arthur Williams on North 26th Street. Arthur Williams shows up in this grand view. This is one of the LPS images where he's controlling a couple dozen men. This is the Prince Hall Masons of Lincoln, standing at 11th and N Streets, where the bus shelters are today, in front of their lodge hall. And right in the center, the shortest guy, but he has the gavel, is the Grand Master of that lodge, and that was Arthur Williams, whose work typically was as a porter. The porter was somebody who carried boxes for a store. For a time, he was the porter at the DePutrin's photo studio, or photo shop, another one of the overlaps. But when we see Arthur Williams here, and then match him up with the guy sitting on the porch, we can identify a couple of very lovely portraits that I had no idea who they were until we got to know Arthur Williams. And these grand portraits with his Masonic jewel hanging. We talk about, and this came through a scholar, Jennifer Hildebrand, a African-American history specialist in the SUNY system, State University of New York, who dealt with and used as educational material with their classes some of the early material we developed on the Johnson photos, that these are emblematic of the New Negro movement. And that was the current that was running through communities across the country in the teens and 20s. Harlem Renaissance, everybody's heard of, that's the full flowering of the New Negro movement, but it's happening all over the country. And it was particularly happening in little places like Lincoln, Nebraska. And the idea was, and the term meant, and it was used by the people involved in it at the time, the new Negroes would identify themselves. They would tell you, they would write their literature, they would perform they would create their art. They weren't waiting for somebody else, and they weren't waiting for dominant culture to say who they were. They were creating their own images. These are new Negro movement images. That's what Johnson's creating in the Lincoln community, in our little Lincoln, Nebraska, the little capital in the middle of the country. Same thing that's happening in New York, Kansas City. The NAACP comes out of the New Negro movement. All of that flowering was happening everywhere, and we've got the pictures to prove it. That's what time we have available today. I can take a few questions. We may be off. We can turn off the show, John, and if people have a few questions, and then I'll jump on my bike and go over to my next meeting.